He was a farmer. That was the beginning and the end of it. The truth of him was written in the lines on his hands, in the permanent stoop of his shoulders, and in the quiet resignation of his eyes. He saw the orc woman change to a cart in the rain, and for some reason that defied a lifetime of keeping his head down, he cut her loose before anyone could stop him. The rain was a cold, miserable thing, not the life-giving wash of spring, but the grim, soul-sucking drizzle of a world sliding into winter. It turned the path to the market town of Oakhaven into a ribbon of black sludge. Elian pulled the collar of his worn wool cloak tighter, the dampness seeping into his very bones. It was a day for staying inside by a fire, not for a 10-mile trek for salt, lamp oil, and a new whetstone. But the larder was getting low, and the world did not pause for a farmer's comfort. He'd lived alone for 10 years, on a small, stubborn plot of land carved out of the foothills of the Broken Tusk Range. The town was south, the mountains north. He existed in the space between, belonging to neither. His life was a rhythm of chores dictated by the seasons: planting, weeding, harvesting, mending. It was a small life, a quiet one. He had chosen it for that quiet. The noise of the world, of cities and armies and kings, had already cost him everything once. He had no desire to hear it again. He heard the cart before he saw it, the groan of an ungreased axle, the splash of hooves, the low murmur of harsh voices. He stepped off the path, melting into the grey curtain of dripping pines as he had learned to do long ago. It was best to be unseen. Travellers on this road were seldom the friendly sort. The procession that emerged from the mist was a grim one. 2 bored-looking human mercenaries in rusted mail led the way, their spears held loosely. Behind them, a single mud-spattered ox pulled a heavy, 2-wheeled cart, and chained to the floor of that cart was the reason for the procession: an orc, a female. She was a study in wretchedness. Her grey-green skin was slick with rain and streaked with mud. Her black hair was plastered to her skull. A crude iron collar was locked around her throat, connected by a heavy chain to a ring bolt on the cart's floor. She wore nothing but thin, ragged trousers and a torn tunic, offering no protection from the biting wind. Elian had seen orcs before, mostly from a distance, raiding parties sometimes. But this was different. This wasn't a warrior captured in glorious battle. This was degradation. It was a spectacle of humiliation, slow marching down a public road. 2 more mercenaries, these ones clearly orcs themselves, brought up the rear, their heavy tusked jaws set in grim lines. They wore the sigil of the Bloodied Axe clan, a splinter group known for its cruelty. He should have stayed hidden. He should have let them pass, let the world continue on its ugly, indifferent way. It was not his business. He was a farmer. He had fields to till and fences to mend. He had nothing to do with the politics of orcs or the sadism of mercenaries. But he made the mistake of looking at her face. Her head was bowed, but as the cart drew level with his hiding place, she lifted it. Her eyes, the colour of amber in a dark room, swept the trees. They were not broken. They were not pleading. They were filled with a fury so cold and so absolute, it was like staring into the heart of a winter storm. In those eyes, he saw not a victim, but a cornered predator. He saw a queen on a slave block. And something inside him, a piece of the man he used to be before the war, before the loss, before the long, silent years, cracked open. He didn't think. Thought was a luxury for men with options. He simply acted. He stepped out from the trees. The lead mercenary turned, his face a mask of surprise. What's this? A mud-crawling mushroom picker? Elian ignored him. He kept his eyes on the cart, on the chain. He had his wood axe in his belt, its hickory handle worn smooth from use, its blade honed sharp enough to shave with. He walked forward with the steady, unhurried pace of a man walking his own fields. "Get out of the road, old man," the second mercenary snarled, lowering his spear. Elian didn't stop. The world narrowed to the path, the cart, the chain. The rain on his face felt distant. The cold was gone. There was only the task. He reached the cart. The orc woman stared at him, her amber eyes wide with disbelief. He could see the muscles in her powerful shoulders tense, ready to fight, to die. He gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod. He did not look at her guards. He looked at the heavy iron ring bolt securing her chain to the weathered planks of the cart. It was old, sunk deep into the wood, a good, solid target. He drew his axe. The movement was fluid, practiced, the motion of a man who had swung an axe 10,000 times, not in battle, but against oak and ash and maple. It was a part of him. The first mercenary lunged, shouting a curse. He was too slow. Elian swung. The axe fell not on a man, but on the iron bolt. Steel screamed against iron. The sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet woods. The bolt, rusted and stressed, shattered. The chain fell loose. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The mercenaries, the orcs, the ox, all frozen in stunned silence at the sheer, suicidal audacity of it. A farmer, a simple farmer, had just attacked them. Then chaos erupted. The orc woman moved like a viper striking. Even weakened, even cold, she was a blur of motion. She launched herself from the cart, using the broken chain as a whip. The heavy links caught the nearest mercenary across the face with a sickening crunch of bone. He went down without a sound. Elian didn't wait to see more. He grabbed the woman's arm. It felt like grabbing a bundle of steel cables wrapped in cold skin. "This way," he yelled, his voice raw. He plunged back into the woods, dragging her with him. Shouts and curses followed them, the sounds of a pursuit being hastily organized. But they were chasing a farmer in his own forest. It was like chasing a ghost in a graveyard. He knew every game trail, every hollow log, every stream that would hide their scent. He ran, his lungs burning, his hand clamped around her arm, pulling her through the dense, wet undergrowth. She did not stumble. She matched his pace, her bare feet seeming to find purchase where his worn boots slipped. She was hurt, she was exhausted, but she was alive with a terrifying vitality. They ran for what felt like an eternity, until the sounds of pursuit faded, lost to the drumming of the rain and the pounding of his own heart. He finally stopped in a deep, mossy ravine, hidden from view, and leaned against a towering oak, gasping for air. The oak woman stood a few feet away, her chest heaving. The broken collar was still around her neck. She looked at him, her amber eyes narrowed, searching his face. The fury was still there, but now it was banked, replaced by a wary, dangerous curiosity. He had done it. He had cut her loose. Now he had a half-naked, half-starved, and fully lethal orc fugitive in his woods, and her enemies knew what he looked like. His quiet life was over. He pushed himself off the tree. His legs felt shaky. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache of fear. What had he done? "My farm," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's close. Shelter. Warmth." She didn't answer. She just watched him, her head tilted slightly. She was judging him, weighing him. He saw the calculation in her eyes. He was a human, a soft, weak thing by her people's standards, but he had freed her. He had attacked 4 armed guards with a wood axe for a total stranger. It made no sense. He understood her suspicion. It was the most logical thing in the world. Kindness without a clear price was the most dangerous currency of all. "Come or don't," he said, turning his back on her. It was a gamble, a massive risk. She could kill him from behind without a sound, but showing fear now would be the end of him. He had to trust the instinct that had made him step out of the woods in the first place. He started walking. He listened for the sound of her footsteps behind him. For a long moment, there was only the drip of water from the leaves. Then he heard it. The soft, near-silent tread of bare feet on wet earth. She was following him. The farm was not much. A one-room stone cottage with a thatched roof, a small barn, and a few acres of tilled land wrested from the forest's grip. A low stone wall marked its boundary. To Elian, it was the whole world. As they approached, he saw it through her eyes. Small, vulnerable, isolated. A pathetic little holdfast against the wilderness. He led her to the cottage door and pushed it open. The inside was dark and smelled of stale smoke, iron, and old winters. He went straight to the hearth, where embers still glowed beneath a layer of ash. With practiced hands, he added kindling and coaxed a small flame to life. He turned back to her. She stood just inside the doorway, a wild, wary creature framed by the grey light. She hadn't moved a muscle. Rainwater dripped from her hair, forming a puddle on the stone floor. Her eyes darted around the small space, taking in every detail. The single cot, the rough-hewn table, the tools hanging on the wall. Assessing threats, finding escape routes. "You are cold," he said. It was a stupidly obvious statement. He went to a wooden chest at the foot of his cot and pulled out a thick wool blanket. It was old and patched, but it was clean and dry. He held it out to her. She flinched as he approached, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Her hand, still wrapped in the broken chain, came up slightly, ready to strike. He stopped. He didn't drop the blanket. He just held it, waiting. He let her see his open, empty hands. He let her see the weariness in his face. He was not a threat. He was a fool who had gotten in over his head. "Lady," he said, his voice quiet, "if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this." The dry, situational irony of his own grim reality seemed to land somewhere in her guarded mind. Her posture relaxed by a fraction. Her eyes flickered from his face to the blanket, then back. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and took it from him. Her fingers brushed his. They were ice cold. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, clutching it tightly. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. He turned back to the fire, adding more wood until it was a healthy, crackling blaze. The warmth began to push back the damp chill. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and hung it over the flames. Then he went to his larder. It was meagre: a half loaf of dark bread, a wedge of hard cheese, some dried apples, and a strip of salted pork. He sliced the bread and cheese, arranged it on a wooden plate, and set it on the table. "Food," he said, gesturing to the table. She watched him, unmoving. He sighed, took a piece of bread and cheese himself, and ate it slowly, showing her it wasn't poisoned. He felt ridiculous, like a man trying to tame a wolf. Finally, she moved. She walked to the table with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in the cramped cottage. She stood over the plate for a moment, then picked up a piece of bread. She ate it quickly, tearing at it with her teeth, but her eyes never left him. She ate everything on the plate, then looked at him, a silent demand for more. He gave her the rest of the loaf and the last of the pork. She devoured it all. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and finally spoke. Her voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "Why?" One word. It hung in the air between them, heavy with 100 other questions. "Why did you help me? Why risk your life? What do you want from me?" Elian looked into the fire. He thought about the men who had been holding her. He thought about the coldness in their eyes, a stark contrast to the fire in hers. He thought about his wife and daughter, lost to a pointless border skirmish years ago, victims of other people's ambitions. "I don't like seeing things in cages," he said simply. It was the truest thing he could offer. She seemed to consider this. Her gaze fell to the iron collar still around her neck. Her fingers traced its edge. Then she looked at the broken shackle still dangling from her wrist. "This," she said, holding up her chained wrist. "Off." It was a command, not a request. He nodded. "I have a forge, small, for tools. Tomorrow, when the rain stops." She gave a short, sharp nod of her own. An agreement, a truce of a sort. The water in the kettle began to whistle. He took it off the fire and found his medical supplies. A small box with clean rags, a pot of foul-smelling salve, and a needle and thread. He gestured to a gash on her arm that he had noticed earlier, a deep cut oozing blood. "That needs cleaning," he said. She looked down at the wound as if noticing it for the first time, then back at him. The suspicion returned to her eyes tenfold. To allow someone to tend your wounds was to show weakness, to offer an opening. "Go ahead," she whispered, her voice like a drawn blade. It was a challenge. "Touch me." see what happens." He met her gaze. He saw the fear she was trying to hide with aggression. He understood. He set the supplies on the table and stepped back. "You do it," he said. "It's clean." He watched as she clumsily cleaned the wound with her other hand, her movements stiff and awkward. She hissed in pain as the herbal wash stung the raw flesh. He saw her pride warring with her pain. After a moment he couldn't stand it. He let out a long, weary sigh. "Here." He stepped forward again, slowly. He didn't reach for her arm. He picked up a clean rag and dipped it in the hot water. He wrung it out and held it out to her on his open palm. "For the pain," he said. "The warmth helps." She stared at the steaming cloth for a long moment. Then, with infinite reluctance, she took it and pressed it against the wound. A shudder ran through her body, a sound that was half groan, half sigh of relief. He sat back down at the table and began to sharpen a knife, giving her space, giving her privacy in her pain. He didn't look at her, but he was aware of her every movement. The sharp intake of breath as she applied the salve, the quiet grunts of effort as she tried to bandage it herself. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. He had brought a storm into his house. He could only wait and see if it would tear the roof from over his head. That night, he gave her the cot and the blanket. He slept on the floor by the fire, his wood axe by his side. Not because he feared she would attack him in his sleep, he strangely didn't, but because he feared the men who would come looking for her. He slept in fits, his dreams filled with the scream of steel on iron and a pair of burning amber eyes. He woke before dawn. The fire had burned down to embers. The cottage was cold. He looked over at the cot. It was empty. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought she was gone. Then he saw her. She was standing by the single small window, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn grey. She was still wrapped in his blanket, staring out at the rain-soaked fields. She had not slept. He rose quietly and rebuilt the fire. As the flames caught, he saw that the water bucket by the door, which had been half empty, was now full to the brim. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. She must have gone out in the dark to the well, a small, unspoken gesture, a payment. He said nothing. He just put the kettle on and began to prepare a thin porridge. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the coiled energy in her stillness. She was a leader, he realized. Even in rags, even in his humble cottage, she commanded the space she occupied. After their silent breakfast, he led her out to the small, lean-to structure that served as his forge. It was a simple setup: a stone hearth, a hand-operated bellows, a sturdy anvil, and a collection of mismatched tools. It was where he mended ploughshares and shod his ox, where he beat his frustrations into stubborn metal. She followed him inside, her eyes taking in the tools with a professional's appraisal. She ran a hand over the cold, smooth face of the anvil. "This is good iron," she said. It was the most she had said at one time. "It was my father's," he replied, firing up the forge. He worked the bellows, and the coals began to glow, breathing heat and light into the gloomy morning. "The collar first," she said, turning her back to him and tilting her head forward, exposing the back of her neck. It was an act of profound trust. He could have ended her right there. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the lock. It was a crude, brutal thing. No keyhole. It had been hammered shut. It would have to be cut. "This will be hot," he warned, and loud. "I have known both," she replied, her voice muffled. He heated the chisel until it glowed cherry red. He took a deep breath. "Hold still." He placed the chisel against the lock's hinge and struck it once, hard, with a heavy hammer. The sound was deafening in the small space. The collar vibrated, but held. She didn't flinch. He struck again, and again. Sparks flew. The smell of hot iron filled the air. On the fifth blow, the hinge gave way. The two halves of the iron collar fell to the dirt floor with a clang. She straightened up slowly, rubbing the raw, chafed skin on her neck. There were dark bruises there, and a permanent indentation in the skin. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes other than fury or suspicion. It might have been gratitude. Next was the shackle on her wrist. This was more delicate work. He couldn't just hammer it off without breaking her arm. He used a file, painstakingly working his way through the thick iron link by link. It took over an hour. His arms ached. She stood perfectly still the entire time, her chained hand resting on the anvil, her gaze fixed on the distant, cloud-shrouded peaks of the Broken Tusk Mountains. It was as if she was drawing strength from them. When the last link finally parted, she pulled her hand back and flexed her fingers. She looked at her freed hands, then at him. "My name is Gorza," she said. "Elian," he replied. It was an introduction, a beginning. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. A fragile peace settled over the small farm. Gorza did not leave. She did not say if she planned to. She simply stayed. Elian went about his work. He repaired the fence where the winter winds had started to pry it loose. He cleared a patch of ground for a late-season planting of turnips. He split firewood, stacking it high against the cottage wall. He worked with the steady, unthinking pace of a man who knew no other way to live. And he found that his work was being anticipated. One morning, he went out to split wood and found the pile of uncut logs already arranged, the toughest, gnarliest ones on top, easy to access. Another day, he came back from checking his snares to find that a loose stone in the cottage wall had been replaced and mortared with a skill that surpassed his own. He would start a task, and when he returned to it, it would be partially, silently, completed. She never spoke of it. She moved with a quiet efficiency, observing his routines and then integrating herself into them. He watched her from the corner of his eye as he worked. She had an economy of motion, a purpose in every step. When she stacked firewood, it was a fortress wall. When she sharpened his spare axe head, she did it with the focused intensity of a warrior preparing for battle. She was contributing, earning her keep. Or perhaps she was simply bored. Orcs, he gathered, were not made for sitting still. One evening, a cold snap hit. The wind howled around the corners of the cottage, finding every crack in the stone. Elian had fallen asleep in his chair by the fire, exhausted from a long day of digging a new drainage ditch. He woke with a start in the deep of the night. The fire was dying, and a chill had settled deep in his bones. He shivered, and a shadow moved from the corner of the room. It was Gauza. She came to the hearth, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. She added several logs to the fire, her movements precise and quiet. As the flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the walls, she looked over at him. He had his own blanket, but it had slipped from his shoulders. She hesitated for a moment. Then she crossed the room, picked up the thick wool blanket from her cot, and gently draped it over his shoulders, tucking it in around his neck. It was a gesture of such unexpected, simple kindness that it stole the breath from his lungs. Her hand brushed his cheek, and her skin was warm. He pretended to be asleep, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard her stand there for a long moment, then move back to her spot in the shadows. A vulnerable gesture, a reciprocal act of care. The quiet of the cottage was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. They began to talk, not in long conversations, but in short, clipped exchanges by the fire at night. "You are a good smith," she said one evening, watching him mend a broken pothook. "I'm a farmer," he said. "A smith mends swords. I mend tools." "A blade is a tool," she countered. "A plowshare can be a weapon. It is a matter of intent." He had no answer for that. Another night she saw him staring into the flames, a familiar sadness in his eyes. "You lost someone," she stated. It wasn't a question. He nodded, his throat tight. He hadn't spoken of it in years. "My wife, my daughter, in the last war. A border raid. Not soldiers, just men with an excuse to be cruel." "They were not soldiers," Gauza said, her voice hard as flint. "Soldiers fight for a purpose. Men who are merely cruel fight for a feeling. It is a weakness." She spat into the fire. "My clan, they have forgotten this. They mistake cruelty for strength." It was the most she had ever revealed about her past, a hint of betrayal, of a schism in her own world. She spoke of her people with a mixture of fierce pride and bitter disappointment. He learned to read her moods not by her words, but by the way she held her shoulders, the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes would gaze north towards the mountains. He learned that she had a warrior's discipline, but a leader's burden. He saw the weight she carried, and he found himself wanting to ease it, if only for a little while. He taught her things, how to tell which mushrooms were safe to eat, how to read the weather in the clouds, small, practical pieces of his life. She taught him things in return, how to set a snare that could hold a wild boar, how to move through the forest without making a sound, how to see in the dark by trusting his other senses. She was teaching him how to survive in the world she came from. One afternoon, as a light snow began to fall, dusting the world in white, he found her at the edge of his property by the low stone wall. She was staring north. "They will come," she said, her voice quiet. "They cannot allow me to live. It would show weakness." Who are they? He asked, though he already knew the answer. The men from the cart, the bloodied axe clan. My cousin, she said, a universe of bitterness in that one word. Crag. He believes a leader must be feared. I believe a leader must be followed. Our clan is divided. And you were to be the example, he guessed. The price of defiance. She nodded, her gaze sweeping over his small, peaceful farm. He would burn this to the ground to get to me. You should not be here when he comes. This is my home, Elian said, his voice stubborn. I don't run. You are one man, a farmer. I am, he agreed, and you are here. So now we are two. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a beautiful, dangerous thing. Two, she repeated, as if testing the word. Then we will stand. The thaw was over. Winter was coming. The first sign came 3 days later. Elian was checking his perimeter, a habit from a past life he had resumed since Gauze's arrival. Near the path, half hidden in the fresh snow, he found it. A track. A boot print larger than any human's, with a distinctive cleated pattern he had never seen before. Orc. A single scout. He knelt, examining it. The snow was crisp, the edges of the print still sharp. It was fresh, from last night. He followed the tracks. They circled his property at a distance, a careful, professional reconnaissance. He found where the scout had climbed a tall pine for a better view of the cottage and the barn. He found where the scout had stopped, turned, and headed back north. He returned to the cottage, his face grim. Gauze was by the fire, honing the blade of his wood axe. She looked up as he entered, and she knew at once. "They've found us," she said. "One scout," he confirmed. "He knows we're here. He'll be back, with friends." The fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered. The air in the cottage became thick with tension. The quiet domesticity was replaced by the grim calculus of war. "How many?" he asked. "Crag is cautious," she said, her hands never ceasing their work on the whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound. He will not risk his full force on a farmer's hut. He will send a test, a handful of his best, to probe, to see what resistance he will meet. How many is a handful? 5, maybe 6. Elian's blood ran cold. 6 orc warriors against 1 farmer and 1 unarmed, albeit highly skilled, fugitive. The odds were not good. "We should run," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "No," Gauze said, her voice flat and final. She put down the axe. The blade was now so sharp it seemed to hum in the low light. Running is what he expects. Running is a confession of weakness. We do not run. We fight. We show him that this will cost him blood. His blood. Her certainty was terrifying, and strangely, it was calming. He had a purpose again, a clear, simple, and probably fatal one. "All right," he said, his own voice surprising him with its steadiness. "Then we prepare." They had 2 days. They used every minute. Gauze was transformed. The quiet, watchful companion was gone, replaced by a field commander. She walked the perimeter of the farm with him, her amber eyes seeing not fields and fences, but kill zones and lines of fire. "The woods are our ally," she said, pointing to the dense forest that bordered his western field. "They will come from the north along the path. It is the direct route. Arrogant. We will not meet them there." She had him dig pits on the main path and cover them with a lattice of branches and snow. She had him sharpen stakes and set them at an angle at the bottom. He worked until his back screamed and his hands were raw. He, in turn, showed her the secrets of his own land. He showed her the weak spot in the barn roof where he could climb to get a high vantage point. He showed her the narrow gain trail that led from the back of the cottage down to the ravine, a hidden escape route. He showed her the old dry well behind the barn, a perfect place for an ambush. They worked together, their movements synchronized, their purpose singular. He would bring her a tool and she would know how to use it. She would point to a spot and he would know what needed to be done. They spoke little, but they communicated perfectly. On the second night, they sat by the fire, the cottage turned into a makeshift armory. He had his axe, a pitchfork, and a heavy mallet. She had his other axe. He felt woefully under-equipped. "It is not the weapon," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "It is the will to use it. You have that." "I have the will to defend my home," he corrected. "It is the same thing," she said. The attack came just before dawn on the third day. A faint sound carried on the wind, the crunch of heavy boots on snow. Gorza was on her feet instantly, a predator scenting prey. "They're here," she whispered. They took their positions. Gorza melted into the shadows near the front door. Elian climbed the ladder to his small loft, peering through a crack in the wall. He saw them emerge from the trees, 5 of them, huge, hulking shapes in the grey light, armed with cruel-looking swords and spiked clubs. They moved with a swaggering confidence, fanning out as they approached the cottage. They were walking right towards the pits. Elian held his breath. The lead orc took another step, and the ground beneath him simply vanished. He disappeared with a surprised grunt, followed by the sickening, wet thud of his body hitting the stakes below. A second orc, startled, jumped to the side and landed right in the middle of the second trap. His scream was cut short. The remaining 3 stopped, stunned. Their confident advance was broken. They stared at the traps, then at the silent, dark cottage. They had expected a farmer. They had found a battlefield. "Now," Gorza breathed from below. It was his cue. Elian had a pile of rocks and old broken pottery next to him. He began to hurl them at the barn roof on the far side of the yard. The clatter was deafening in the dawn quiet. The 3 remaining orcs spun towards the sound, raising their shields, expecting an attack from that direction. It was the opening Gorza needed. She exploded from the cottage door. She was not a woman. She was a storm. In her hands, his simple wood axe became a thing of terrible beauty. She moved with a speed and ferocity that defied belief. Before the first orc could even turn back around, she was on him, The axe swung in a silver arc, cleaving through his leather armor and deep into his shoulder. He went down, howling. The other two charged her, roaring with rage. She met them head-on. It was not a fight, it was a butchering. She parried a sword strike with the haft of her axe, spun inside the orc's guard, and drove the butt of the handle into his throat. He staggered back, choking, clutching at his neck. The last one, the biggest of the lot, swung his spiked club in a wide, vicious arc. Gorza dropped, letting it whistle over her head. As she came up, she swung her own axe low, severing the tendons in his leg. He bellowed in pain and collapsed. It was over in less than a minute. Elian scrambled down from the loft, his heart pounding. He stood in the doorway, staring at the carnage. Gorza stood in the middle of the blood-soaked snow, her chest heaving. She was splattered with gore, but she was magnificent, a goddess of war, standing on his humble doorstep. She looked at him, her amber eyes blazing with the fire of combat. Then the fire banked, and she was just Gorza again. Wounded, tired. "The fast weave," she said, her voice strained. She had a long, shallow cut on her arm. "There will be more." He knew she was right. They had won the skirmish, but they had just declared war. Crag knew she was here, and he knew she was not alone. He would not make the same mistake twice. The next time, he would come himself, and he would bring everyone. The calm after the battle was more unnerving than the fight itself. They cleaned up the grim aftermath, dragging the bodies into the woods. Gorza showed him how to strip them of their weapons and armor, her movements practical and devoid of sentiment. They now had 3 mismatched orcish swords, some dented leather armor, and a sense of impending doom. Elian's farm, his sanctuary, felt violated. The blood in the snow would melt, but the memory would remain. He looked at his home, at the quiet cottage and the sturdy barn, and he knew with a certainty that was a cold, hard knot in his stomach, that it would not survive what was coming. That night, a strange thing happened. As they sat by the fire cleaning the newly acquired weapons, a sound came from outside. Not the sound of an enemy. It was a call. A long, low call, like a wolf's howl but deeper, more resonant. Gorza went still. She lifted her head, listening. The call came again. She rose and went to the door, opening it a crack. She answered with a call of her own, a mirror of the one they had heard. A tense silence followed. Then heavy footsteps approached. Elian grabbed his axe, his knuckles white. Gorza held up a hand. "Wait." A massive figure loomed in the doorway. An orc, even larger than the ones they had fought, clad in heavy furs and carrying a notched, 2-handed axe. But this one was different. This one was female. Her face was a roadmap of old scars, and her eyes, when they fell on Gorza, were filled with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. Behind her, 3 more orcs appeared, all female, all armed and ready for battle. The lead orc dropped to one knee in the snow. "War Chief," she rumbled, her voice thick with emotion. "We found you." And just like that, the secret was out. Gorza was not just a fugitive, she was a war chief. The old orc, whose name was Grulner, explained everything. They were part of Gorza's personal guard, her loyal retainers who had refused to bend the knee to Crag. They had been scattered after his coup, but had been searching for her ever since. They had heard whispers of a battle at a human farm on the edge of the Tusclands and had come to investigate. Elian listened to all of this, feeling a chasm opening at his feet. He had been harbouring not just an orc, but a political leader, a noble, a general. He had been tending the wounds and sharing his bread with someone who likely commanded armies. The quiet connection he thought they had built, the partnership of two equals against the world, felt like a lie. He felt like a fool, a simple-minded farmer who had stumbled into a grand, epic saga far beyond his comprehension. He had seen her as Gorza, the woman who draped a blanket over him when he was cold, but the world saw her as War Chief Gorza of the Iron Tusk clan, rightful heir to the Blood Throne, or whatever it was they called it. He felt a sharp, bitter sting of betrayal. Not because she had lied, she had told him almost nothing after all, but because he had allowed himself to believe in a fantasy. He had imagined a future where they could just be. A farmer and a fugitive living a quiet life. How naive he had been. She was a chief. Her world was one of battles and politics and succession. His world was one of dirt and seasons. The two could never mix. He retreated into himself. While Gorza and her warriors spoke in low, urgent Orcish, planning their next move, he stood by the fire, feeling like a ghost in his own home. He was no longer her partner. He was her host, a temporary convenience, a footnote in her story. Gorza must have sensed his withdrawal. She came to him after her council of war was finished. Her retainers watched him with open suspicion. To them, he was just a human, a complication. "Elian," she said, her voice softer than it had been with her warriors. "War Chief," he replied, the title feeling foreign and bitter on his tongue. He did not look at her. He felt her flinch as if he had struck her. "That is my title. It is not my name." "It seems to be the most important thing about you," he said, the hurt making his words sharper than he intended. I thought you were just Gorza." "I am," she insisted, stepping closer. "The woman you pulled from that cart is the same woman standing before you now." "Is she?" he asked, finally meeting her eyes. "The woman I pulled from the cart was alone and hunted. This woman has an army. The woman I knew needed a farmer with an axe. This woman needs... What does she need a farmer for at all?" Before she could answer, a shout came from the warrior posted outside. "They are coming! The main force! Crag is with them!" The final siege had begun. There was no time for tactics, no time for clever traps. The horizon to the north was dark with figures, dozens of them, an army. Crag had brought his entire faction. He was not just coming to kill Gorza, he was coming to erase her and anyone who stood with her from existence. "To the barn," Gorza commanded her warriors. "It is more defensible." "No," Elian said, his voice flat. He looked at the oncoming horde, then at his small stone cottage. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was where he had found a flicker of life again. "They will not take this from me." He walked to the centre of his yard, pitchfork in hand, and planted his feet. Gorza stared at him, her eyes wide. Her warriors looked at her, confused. "This is my land," Elian said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in a decade. "I will not surrender it." It was madness. It was suicide. But in that moment, Gorza saw him, truly saw him. Not as a farmer, not as a human, not as a pet, but as a man of unshakable, irrational, and utterly magnificent integrity. She saw the same stubborn pride that fueled her own heart. A fierce grin split her face. "Then we stand with him, on his land," she roared to her warriors. "For the hearth, for the home." They formed a line with him, 4 orc warriors and 1 farmer, standing before a burning cottage, facing an army. It was a scene from a mad poet's dream. The battle was a blur of desperate, brutal violence. Urkrag's forces crashed against their tiny shield wall like a wave against a single, stubborn rock. Elian fought not with skill, but with fury. He was not a soldier, but he was defending his home. His pitchfork became a spear, his mallet became a warhammer. He fought for every inch of his land. His barn was set ablaze. The flames rose into the night sky, a funeral pyre for his quiet life. He saw his cottage door splintered by a heavy axe. His world was being torn apart. But he was not alone. To his left, Gorza moved like a whirlwind of death, her father's axe a blur of motion. To his right, Grolna and the other warriors fought with the grim determination of those with nothing left to lose. They were outnumbered 10 to 1, but they made the enemy pay for every step. Finally, Urkrag himself strode forward, cutting a path through the melee. He was a mountain of an orc, clad in black iron armor, a cruel sneer on his face. "Sister," he boomed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at you, hiding behind a human and his hovel. Is this the strength you promised our clan?" He kicked a fallen piece of Elian's fence aside. "I will burn his little world, and then I will take you back in chains. This time, there will be no escapes." Gorza met his charge. Their axes clashed, the sound echoing over the din of battle. They were a match in strength, but Urkrag was fresher, better armoured. He slowly began to drive her back towards the burning ruins of the cottage. Elian saw it happening. He saw one of Urkrag's lieutenants moving to flank Gorza, to strike her from behind while she was engaged. Without a thought, Elian charged. He drove his pitchfork deep into the lieutenant's side, pulling him off balance. The orc roared and turned on him, swinging a massive sword. Elian threw himself to the side, the blade missing his head by inches. He scrambled back, his pitchfork lost, his only weapon now a small hand axe. He was going to die. He knew it. But he would die on his feet, defending this place, defending her. But as the orc raised his sword for the killing blow, a shadow fell over him. It was Gorza. She had seen his desperate charge. She had seen him save her. She had disengaged from Urkrag for a single, vital second. She brought her axe down, and the lieutenant fell. That second cost her. Urkrag, seizing the opening, slammed the flat of his axe into her side, sending her stumbling to her knees. He stood over her, his axe raised, a triumphant leer on his face. "It is over," he gloated. But it wasn't. In that moment of chaos, with the battle raging around them, with her enemy looming over her, Gorza did the most unexpected, insane thing possible. She ignored Urkrag. She looked past him, her gaze locking with Elian's across the blood-soaked yard. Her voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the noise of the fight. She spoke not in Orcish, but in the common tongue for all to hear. "Elian of the Black Soil," she shouted, giving him a title, a place. "You have defended my hearth. You have fought for my honor. You have shown strength not of arms, but of spirit. I, Gorza of the Iron Tusk, claim you. I name you Ashgar, my chosen, my shield, my mate. Your home is my home, and my clan is your clan. Stand with me." It was a public declaration, a political bombshell. In the middle of a battle for her life, she was rewriting the rules of her culture, binding a human farmer to her in the most sacred way possible. Urkrag stared at her, dumbfounded. "You would disgrace our bloodline with this thing?" His hesitation was his undoing. "Then stand," Elian whispered to himself, his voice thick with awe and something else, something he hadn't let himself feel for a very long time. He picked up a fallen orc sword, a weapon too heavy and unbalanced for him, and charged. His charge was a distraction, nothing more, but it was enough. Gorza, using Urkrag's shock to her advantage, swept his legs out from under him. The giant orc crashed to the ground. Her loyalists, galvanized by her declaration, surged forward with renewed fury. The tide of the battle turned. Urkrag's forces, seeing their leader fall and witnessing their sacred traditions shattered, faltered. Their morale broke. They began to flee into the night. The battle was won. But the farm was lost. Elian stood in the smoking ruins of his life. The cottage was a gutted shell. The barn was a pile of glowing embers. His fields were trampled and blood-stained. Everything he had built over 10 years was gone. He felt empty. Gorza came to him, her face smudged with soot, her armor dented. Her warriors were tending the wounded and securing the prisoners, including a bound and gagged Urkrag. "You have lost your home because of me," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "Yes," he said simply. He looked at the wreckage. It was just wood and stone. The quiet he had built here had been an illusion, a wall against a world that always, eventually, breaks in. She reached out, her hand hovering just above his arm. "My declaration, it was made in the heat of battle, a strategy. If you wish to refuse—" "Did you mean it?" he interrupted, his eyes searching hers. "Every word," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He thought for a long moment. He could walk away, head south to Oakhaven, find work as a labourer and disappear again, rebuild his quiet life. Or he could step into the fire. "You offered me a place in your clan," he said. "You offered me your protection." "I did," she confirmed. "I don't want your protection," he said, "and I won't hide behind your title. I am a farmer, a builder, a smith of sorts. I am not a warrior, and I am not a lord." He met her gaze, his own resolve hardening. "If I come with ye, I come as I am. I will stand beside you, not behind you. I will work. I will build. I will be alien, the human, in the heart of your clan. They will accept me as I am, or not at all. It was his condition, his term. He would not be a kept man, a political token. He would be a partner, an equal. Gorza looked at him, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated admiration. She had offered him a safe harbour, and he had demanded to sail the storm with her. She smiled, a true, genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "Then stand," she said. And so they left. They abandoned the ruins of the farm, the last remnant of Elian's old life, and marched north. A small, strange procession. An orc war chief, a loyal guard, her captured rival, and the human farmer who had chosen to walk into a legend. The next year was the hardest of Elian's life. Gorza's clan hold, Kardarak, was a fortress carved into the heart of a mountain, a place of stone, steel, and suspicion. When she returned with a chained crag and a human consort, the clan was thrown into turmoil. Elian was an object of scorn and mistrust. To the orcs of the Iron Tusk, he was a weakness, an oddity, a symbol of their new chief's strange sentimentality. They called him Pinkskin, Milk Drinker, Gorza's pet. The children would throw stones at him. The warriors would shoulder check him in the corridors. He faced prejudice at every turn. But he did not complain. He did not ask Gorza to intervene. This was his battle to fight, and he would fight it his way. He had made a promise. He would work. He claimed the clan's forge, a neglected, inefficient pit of smoke and broken tools. The clan's smith, a grizzled old orc named Borok, sneered at him. "This is orc work, human. You will break." Elian just nodded and set to work. He didn't try to use their oversized hammers or their crude tools. He built his own. He redesigned the flue to draw the smoke properly. He introduced a quenching technique he'd learned from a travelling tinker that made the steel stronger, less brittle. Slowly, the forge was transformed. The tools he mended no longer broke. The ploughshares he forged for their meagre mountain farms turned the rocky soil more easily. When a warrior brought him a sword with a nick in the blade, expecting him to fail, he repaired it so perfectly that the seam was invisible, the balance better than before. Borok stopped sneering and started watching. One day he grunted, "The human knows iron." It was the highest compliment Elian had ever received. He looked at their farms, terraced precariously on the mountainside. They grew one type of hardy moss grain, and when it failed, they starved. Elian, using his farmer's knowledge, introduced the concept of crop rotation, planting tough, nitrogen-fixing mountain legumes in the fallow fields. The next harvest was the most bountiful the clan had seen in a generation. He saw the way their defensive walls were built, all brute force and no engineering. He showed them how to build buttresses, how to create overlapping fields of fire from their guard towers. He used his quiet wisdom, his practical skills, his steady character. He did not try to become an orc. He simply showed them what a human could be. Respect, when it came, was not given freely. It was earned. In inches. In simons. One day, a warrior who had once spat at his feet brought him a wineskin of potent orc grog. He didn't say a word, just set it down by the forge and walked away. It was an apology, an acceptance. He was no longer Gorsa's pet. He was Elian the smith, Elian the builder, Elian Ashgar. He had earned his place. One evening, a year to the day since they had left his ruined farm, Gorsa came to the forge. She was the undisputed chieftain now. She had consolidated her power, banished the last of Urkrag's supporters, and brought a new era of prosperity to the clan, guided by her own strength and her humans' quiet counsel. She was wearing her ceremonial armor, black iron inlaid with silver. It was a suit he had helped design, lighter than traditional orc plate but stronger, more flexible. She had a council meeting. She stopped before him, the glow of the forge fire playing across her powerful frame. "A clasp is loose," she said, her voice low. She turned her back to him. It was a perfect echo of that first morning in his forge when he had cut the slave collar from her neck. Then, it had been an act of desperate necessity and burgeoning trust. Now it was an act of quiet, profound intimacy. His hands, calloused and stained with soot, went to the clasp on her back. The iron was cold, but he could feel the warmth of her skin through the leather underpadding. He deftly fixed the loose pin, his fingers sure and steady. The task was done in a moment, but he let his hand linger for a second longer, resting on the small of her back. She did not move. In the year they had been here, they had been partners in all but the most intimate sense. Always a chief and her consort, always a public performance. But here, in the firelight of the forge, they were just Gorsa and Elian. He drew his hand back. "It is done, chief." She turned to face him. Her amber eyes were soft. "Thank you, Smith." She reached up and touched the scar on her neck, the faint line left by the collar. A gesture he had seen her make 100 times when she was lost in thought. "You freed me," she said. "You were never captive," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You were just inconvenienced." A rare, true laugh escaped her. It was a beautiful sound. She stepped closer, closing the small space between them. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the strength in her grip, the calluses on her palm that matched his own. "I was a farmer," he murmured, summarizing the impossible journey they had taken. "And I was a prisoner," she finished. They stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the hiss of the quenching trough and the steady, rhythmic beat of the forge's heart. He was no longer just a farmer, and she was no longer just a warrior. He had been seen for the strength within his silence, and she had chosen to build a new world with him, a world where strength was not just the power to break, but the courage to build. They were partners, forged in fire and tempered by hardship, and their story was just beginning.